Okay, we can start.
Okay. Uh, so, I mean, Shakespeare did ask this fantastic question, what's in a name? And we will be dwelling on that question from media and entertainment space and how that affects our industry. So this is going to be a brief overview on trademark and how film titles can be protected. Really, if you could go to the next slide. So we are going to be covering basic introduction to trademarks, the life cycle of a trademark in India, and provisions with respect to trademarking or protection of film titles as to what is the jurisprudence of that in India right now. Riddhi, can we move on to the next? So basic question, what is a trademark? Now, according to the Trademark Act 1999, it defines it as a mark which is capable of representing graphically and distinguishing goods and services of one person as opposed to those of others. So there are innumerable goods and services in the market right now. There are different kinds of products, and how a particular mark is associated with the origin of that particular service. That is the uh, use or the necessity of a trademark. So with a trademark, what essentially happens is that the owner gets an exclusive right on the usage. Obviously, then there is identification of where the service or the business goods are coming from. A trademark also symbolizes the kind of quality that you are looking for. So in yeah, also also acts as an advertiser marketing for the owner. And what it does for the owner is that it also gives it a right to prevent others from using the mark, which is similar to the mark of the owner. So Riddhi, if you go on to the next slide. Now, there are innumerable businesses and goods in the country or in the world for that matter. Now, because trademark gives us an exclusivity on that particular trademark, the only way of balancing out that monopoly over the mark is to grant it for a specific section of goods and services, and not in all spectrums of the trade of goods and services. So for example, if there is a trademark in chemicals, for for example, if there's an apple, apple as a mark, while protection can be granted in your electronic goods, till the time it is not a well-known mark, that same mark can be used by another party when it comes to a, a section which is completely unconnected with that of electronic goods. So for example, if it is bedding, so if there is bedding versus electronic goods, if protection is sought for a trademark in that class, it cannot be, it does not give exclusivity to the other the owner with respect to the other classes. When we're like, currently there are 45 classes of goods and services, but what is relevant for our media and entertainment industry would be class 41, which is for entertainment services. Next would be maybe a class 9, which is because it is for uh, software apparatuses, uh, stuff like that. So if you're making tapes or DVDs or software applications, then class 9 also becomes extremely important. What can also be considered while protecting a trademark from media industry is registering it in class 35, because it includes advertising and marketing of as a service. Then I feel that
Nandini,
merchandising.
35 is also covering retail services.
Yeah,
So of course that gets it.
yeah. Then coming to merchandising as a category, which is ongoing and growing as a an ancillary industry. Classes 16, 25, and 28 may also be something that can be considered depending on how the mark is going to be used. Earlier, there used to be a practice where a mark used to get protected in all 45 classes, but with the evolution of trademarks as a law, that practice has also reduced because usage and proving that kind of usage in a section is also very important. While we're discussing classes and exclusive protection for a particular category of goods or services, uh, what is also to be discussed is a well-known trademark. A well-known trademark is
Nandini, before you go there,
yeah.
just a couple more classes that would be of interest from a merchandising standpoint is class 18, because that deals with your leather goods. And oftentimes people would like to extend that merchandising to leather products.
Yeah. So
then there is also in relation to purely a broadcast service that then will come under class 38, because that comes under telecommunication services. So depending on what is most important to consider is that merely because you are running a telecommunication service or providing entertainment under 41 or whatever, and as an ancillary matter only for use within the organization, you have for example, playing cards that are branded with your trademark. To the extent that it's being used as a promotional activity within the office or in the organization, that's fine. And nothing stops you from actually applying for registration under class 16. But this is not stricto sensu in that sense a use, because no one outside of that organization may know that you are actually making playing cards with that brand. Neither are you selling playing cards. So technically speaking,
correct,
you are not carrying out any activity that would get covered under 16 unless you actually do it at a commercial level. But a lot of clients, nevertheless, clients would like to get it registered more from the point of view of just blocking that class and not having another second comer go and apply for that particular trademark in that class.
Yeah, so just from a class 16 perspective, it came from merchandising of stationery, etc., which is growing at a very fast pace right now. That is why I suggested a class 16 as well. Obviously,
you're right. I'm just telling people that what is the background to this.
Yeah, got
in terms of the basics. Secondly, because I'm really old and I've seen the 58 Act also in play. Till such time that the new Act came into play and the new rules were notified in 2002. Indian law only protected trademarks, not service marks.
Yeah.
So classes 35 to 45 now. It was 35 to 42 earlier. Then 42 was split up into 43, 44, 45. So these classes only came about in 2002. So a lot of companies that were really not in the product space, but more in the service space, nevertheless resorted to 9 and 16 to protect their trademarks. From that point, as a matter of strategy.
Okay.
The other thing, Nandini, that you were explaining in relation to the use of Apple in relation to various aspects, there is actually and this is a seminal judgment of the US, if I'm not mistaken, Second Circuit. I could be wrong about the circuit. It is Abercrombie and Fitch versus Huntington Company. That's the first judgment which actually went into a classification of the distinctiveness of a trademark.
Right.
And and that's a good read for anyone who would like to get some further perspective on this classification. So at the highest are two types of marks pretty much vying for the top position. They are known as arbitrary marks and fanciful marks.
That's coming in the next slide.
Oh, it's coming. Okay, sorry. Then I stopped.
Okay. Yeah, so I think you can
please read the judgment. It's Abercrombie versus
Huntington Company.
Oh, okay.
It's a 1950s or 60s decision.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
It's been followed by the Delhi High Court by Justice Ravindra Bhatt in the Evergreen case.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So coming to classification, continuing with classifications.
Nandini, I just have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Class 16, in the third line that I can see, it says artist materials.
Yeah.
What can we protect here specifically? Is it talking about a particular artist? And I'm not very sure of artist material that covers here.
It's more on
artist product, but
it's not the product. It is more on the lines of artistic something that an artist will use to create works. So more on the lines of stationery. 16 is primarily stationery related products. So anything to do with paper, cardboard, paintbrushes, etc. will fall under this category.
So this will include your, when you're talking about an artist, it is more from the point of view of,
an art creator,
or maybe a sculptor, or maybe a painter.
Sure.
So easel, paintbrushes,
or a tool or something.
Yeah, a tool.
Understood.
Or something. Yeah. Obviously, that should not be in any other class, because certain tools which are used by artists for creating art may fall under other categories. Then obviously that needs to be looked into as to what is being used.
Because you must understand that the manner in which this classification has taken place is they want to bunch together like similar stuff. So if, as what Nandini just pointed out, if you continue to read that line that you were reading, it says artists' materials, paint brushes, typewriters and office requisites, within brackets except furniture. As Nandini just pointed out, unless it is covered in another class. So except furniture. Furniture is, if I'm not mistaken, under 20. So 18 or 20, I'm not very sure. And that's how, so you will have these exceptions mentioned in the class itself. So while office furniture should fall within the scope of office requisites, but furniture is excluded.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So now from moving into the fact that a particular trademark gets protection in a particular category for which an application has been made. There is also another category of trademarks which is known as a well-known trademark. Now, there are a lot of times that because of the usage of a mark, the association with that trademark of the public at large is such that any use in any category would be construed as going back to the originator of the first the mark. So for example, Bata, for instance, it's a well-known mark in India. Gillette, for instance, is again a well-known mark in India. So while Gillette may be construed as a trademark in your health and beauty products, it will, because it has been granted a status of well-known mark, if tomorrow somebody makes soda or Coca-Cola or some sort of aerated drink, Gillette still has the right to go and stop the usage because of being an owner of a mark which has acquired such a reputation that anything will come back to be associated with Gillette. So that is an example that I can give you, and that is also a property of to be kept in mind while strategizing around a brand or a trademark. Is that Okay. Okay, I think, sorry. Yeah, so while strategizing, it's very important to ensure that the mark is such that it acquires a secondary meaning to the mark that you have, the mark that you're registering. Riddhi, if you can go to the next slide.
Before you go
Yeah.
there, we just wanted to chip in with regard to well-known trademarks. See, it's from a trademark law, the manner in which it is developed as a fundamental principle is on the question of unfair competition and deceit.
Correct.
Someone has some amount of noise in the background. If you guys could please mute whoever it is. All right. Sorry. Continuing. So it has developed from the law of law of unfair competition and deceit, and that's how you had this concept of passing off. That ideally you should not be cashing in on anyone else's reputation. The reason for that is because if you do so, there is the public interest that is getting injured, which is where the public is likely to get confused. And that's how the likelihood of confusion analysis comes about. The public is likely to get confused about the origin of these goods. And it is, from a public policy standpoint, it is not in the interest of society in general to be confused about what they are buying and what they are paying for and where it originates from. So whenever the trademark law as it has developed has always been looking at the justification for protection of trademark from a public standpoint. You want to protect the confusion among the public. Now, when we go into the zone of well-known trademarks, there, from a jurisprudential standpoint and a basis standpoint, the justification is slightly different. Because here, you are not necessarily protecting the protecting trademark because of the likelihood of confusion, because it's a different class, but you are actually trying to protect the property that has been created by the huge amount of investment that has been invested into development of the goodwill and reputation of that trademark, and that's how it has become well known. And there are factors that are now set out in section 11.6 that you have to look at in order to come to a conclusion as to whether or not your trademark is well known or otherwise. Prior to the 1999 Act, this concept was developed, but more as a common law principle, more as judge-made law, right from Grant and Sons and the Daimler-Benz case, VIP, etc. And of course Bata. So all of those instances where the courts felt that there was this lacuna where perhaps a person or an entity who was trying to get some benefit out of trading on the reputation of another well-known trademark, and so you then had to prove that threshold of being a well-known trademark, which of course was purely judge-made. Now there are factors that have been outlined, and the Trademarks Act has gone to the level of actually also now putting in a provision where a registrant can actually apply to the registrar of trademarks for a declaration that the trademark is well known.
Yeah. Okay, Riddhi, can you move to the next slide?
Can you just briefly tell us, like, what would be the factors which would differentiate a trademark from a well-known trademark?
Like Abhishek said, there are a couple of things that will need to be looked into. One is, how does the public associate a particular mark with public at large, not just people who are using a particular goods or services, but public at large, how the mark will be, how they will associate the mark with the originator. And second is how much investment and how much development of that particular property has been done by the originator is also something which will be looked into. So for example, for people like people like us, a particular brand may be, maybe known to us. This is something which was also dealt with in the Hariputtar case, that, there was a film called Hariputtar, and Warner Brother filed for an injunction against it because they said that it infringed the rights of Harry Potter, and the court said that that would not be the case, only because only a particular set of people would know the reference to a Harry Potter, versus in India there is a full section of category which is not even versed with the idea of a fictional character called Harry Potter. Obviously, this judgment can be debated and discussed at large, but how a mark is associated by public not just using that particular mark, or not just the consumer base, but people as a whole. That's how a well-known mark would be distinguished. That's what would need to be proved.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I just have one question. This is Deep here.
Yeah.
With respect to well-known trademarks, so there's this one recent case that came to the eye was with respect to Roger Federer, where his mark, which was previously owned by Nike, recently got transferred to him, and because he had a deal with Uniqlo. Now, the whole intent of creating this particular trademark was with Nike. And eventually it went up to Roger Federer because of his logo. Now, if I have to figure out if that's a well-known trademark, how will I be able to kind of, me as a Nike, how would I be able to put it across to the courts that, I have spent enough efforts and I've gone about to make sure that this trademark has grown basis on the efforts that we have put across.
Okay. While I'll answer this question, Ahana can chip in whenever she wants to. Now, the whole issue around the Roger Federer, the RF mark, and Nike is arising from a fact that there are two entities involved in it. So while RF, the investment of the mark and the ownership was applied by Nike, a lot of the goodwill of the brand comes in from Roger Federer. So while RF as a brand has been developed by Nike, unless and until there is an arrangement with Roger Federer to use the same, because it forms part of his name and his likeness and his personality, it would not be of any use to continue the same brand when the association between Nike and Roger Federer sort of breaks. So
chip in here, basically, this whole creation of the trademark of Roger Federer, the RF initial, so to speak, it also started from back in the day. I mean, they did it for Tiger Woods, they've done it for Michael Jordan, etc. And Roger Federer particularly was signed up by Nike when he was about 15 or 16 years of age, or even younger maybe. So I don't think at that point in time Roger Federer himself realized that he was going to turn into the icon he turned. And that's the reason he chose to not register a trademark in his name, whereas the trademark was registered by Nike. And that's how the dispute happened. Of course, athletes today are much smarter. They don't let a third party register their trademark, and they all register trademarks on their own. Also, in a sporting scenario, it leads us to a peculiar situation that even though Nike would own the trademark, now that Roger Federer is no longer with Nike, what is Nike really going to do with that trademark? Because largely what the economics of sport largely functions on a fan base, right? So if there is so what you do is you sponsor a particular athlete, you sponsor a particular team simply to be able to attract their fan base to get to buy your products and things like that. So if that Nike's goodwill would get hampered if Nike was not to assign that trademark back to Roger Federer, simply because there would be a revolt against the fan base if Roger Federer was not allowed to use that trademark. Secondly, it's not a hardcore Roger Federer fan will no longer go to a Nike and buy those Roger Federer products, given that they know that Roger Federer now endorses Uniqlo/Uniqlo sponsors Roger Federer. So that puts us also in a very peculiar situation when it comes to sport. that being said, I mean, there are other things that I will touch upon tomorrow with regard to how there is a law now wherein, you know, if somebody has registered your name as a trademark in the UK, then it must transfer back to the person whose name it is, so on and so forth.
Anna and Nandini, just another follow-up question. You know, when you're talking about goodwill, you know, just to draw a comparison with, like, you know, how you talk about Jordans, you know. So, but so when people talk about Jordans, they use the athlete's name and not the brand that's actually making them, as opposed to when you talk about Roger Federer's shoes, you know, nothing like Federer's, you know, or Rogers. It's still a Nike shoe. So does that play any importance in terms of how the association is made more towards the athlete as opposed to the brand itself?
So if you notice, when he signed this Uniqlo deal, he had not got a shoe sponsor deal yet. So for the Wimbledon that came immediately after,
he wore his Nike
still wore
shoes.
Nike shoes, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that of course we do create exceptions in player contracts in general for an athlete to be able to, I mean, I'm talking more not from an individual perspective here, largely from a team perspective. So especially when you're playing a team sport, we create an exception in terms of certain accessories / products that you can sort of endorse your personal brand. But there are disclaimers to it that the logo on such products shall not be a larger logo in such a scenario as compared to what the regular logo size on a particular so if you're wearing a shoe, if I as a Hana go to a Puma store and pick up a Puma shoe and a Virat Kohli goes to a Puma store and picks up a Puma shoe, the logo size will largely be the same on all shoes. It's not like because it's Virat Kohli wearing a particular shoe, you can expand the size of the logo on it. I mean, of course, Uniqlo themselves, since they were not indulging in manufacturing of shoes, would have created that exception in Roger Federer's contract that he was permitted to wear whatever shoes he wanted to wear at that point of time. And therefore, he continued to wear shoes of his own choice. However, of course, people in the sporting scenario and sporting world who generally follow sport would know that it's not an endorsement and it's a mere choice in terms of comfort, what he's wearing, right? So this also, I mean, if I was to put it in another scenario, moving away from the sporting scenario, it's how gripe sites and things function, and that's the logic, because like it's a famous case of NatWest, where somebody made a website called NatWest Sucks, and they were not allowed to run that domain because most people who don't understand English will not understand the difference between natwest.com and natwestsucks.com. For them, it will still be a website where that is owned by NatWest.
Got it.
Right? So it's just one of the things.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great.
I'm just coming in here. Sorry, someone was saying something?
No, please go ahead.
No, so just to, I think the Roger Federer case actually throws up quite a few interesting issues for and I'll just try and highlight those, now. For a moment, I'm just trying to, Riddhi, can you stop sharing your screen for a moment? And I'm just going to share my screen because I've pulled up a provision of the Trademarks Act that I'd like to discuss. Just a second. Just give me a second. Guys, can you see the provision?
Yeah.
Okay, section 14. Where an application is made for the registration of a trademark which falsely suggests a connection with any living person or a person whose death took place within 20 years prior to the date of application for registration of trademark, registrar may, before he proceeds with the application, require the applicant to furnish him with the consent in writing of such living person, or as the case may be of the legal representative of the deceased persons, to the connection appearing on the trademark, and may refuse to proceed with the application unless the applicant furnishes the registrar with such consent. So at least as per Indian law, in the event that I'm actually applying for the name or any indicator which suggests a connection with a living person, in this case Roger Federer, I must provide the consent of that person in writing. Right? And now the question that gets thrown up in this particular case is, first the facts. This consent allegedly by Roger Federer came in when he was 13 years old, as per an article that I was reading up. Could he, of course, the consent would not have come from him, it would have come from his parents. Could he revoke that consent when he attains the age of majority, is the first question. 2, can he revoke this consent at a subsequent point in time? Right? 3, because even in case of a licensing situation, regardless of whether or not the licensee is or an assignee, as the case may be depending on what the terms of the license stroke assignment are, at least in the case of a licensee, the licensee, whatever use that the licensee makes of that trademark inures to the benefit of the licensor. In this case, could this be considered as a licensor-licensee situation? Not only enabling the licensor, Roger Federer, to revoke, but also for Roger Federer to say, look, whatever you invested in it, you may have made your money out of it separately, but it inures to my benefit. So if I want it back today, then that's what it should be. The third purely jurisprudential point in terms of which way this should tilt depending upon what theory that you apply, is that the public, if it's a likelihood of confusion issue, the public is more likely to associate RF with Roger Federer than with Nike. Now, how do you, until such time that Roger Federer continues to endorse Nike, that's fine, because then it's one and the same. Once he moves away, then does the value of the trademark that Nike is vending as RF, does that get diminished because Roger Federer is no longer associated? So I don't have answers to all these questions. I'm just throwing up these issues which this particular case has brought to the fore.
Just to add to this, in an Indian scenario, an interesting case to read would be the counter side, would be Gautam Gambhir versus Gautam Gambhir. In that case, basically the cricketer Gautam Gambhir, of course, filed a suit of this other guy who had set up restaurants in the name Gautam Gambhir. Coincidentally, his name is also Gautam Gambhir, and he didn't put up pictures of Gautam Gambhir anywhere in his restaurants or anything of that sort. And thereby it was ruled against the cricketer because it was good faith usage. Jumping on to the last point that Abhishek brought out with regard to Nike owning the logo, but people associating with Roger Federer, also that most commercial contracts will anyways, largely in a sporting context, will have a clause which will say that you cannot, even though Nike may still own the trademark, they cannot make fresh merchandise of that trademark. Secondly, that any existing merchandise will have to be destroyed in a period of 3 to 6 months. I mean, depending on whatever's put into the contract, right? So given that Nike anyways would not be permitted to manufacture new merchandise, that trademark sort of will not really add any value to Nike by just owning and holding it up.
Also, in relation to the Gautam Gambhir example that you give me, I mean, I'm unfortunately not read that case. I will do that. But the only interesting aspect is and this is my presumption, that the court would have ruled, as you rightly said, in terms of a good faith analysis of usage by the other Gautam Gambhir of that name. Because while the law is very clear that you cannot stop anyone from using their own names, section 34 or 35 of the Act, nevertheless, in the event that it is being used in a manner so as to provide some sort of a link with the other name, which is more famous and maybe registered trademark, then it could be a problem. So if the more famous person is able to demonstrate that this is actually being used in a bad faith sort of scenario, and there are indicators to show that they are actually trading in the goodwill and reputation of the senior user in that sense, then they can of course stop it. But a very interesting analysis of this, of course, that matter got settled finally, is a Ninth Circuit decision of the US Ninth Circuit in California, where a summary judgment was refused in favor of Lucasfilms because they brought a suit against someone who had used the word or trademark Star Wars to do certain events, and they adopted it at a time prior to the first Star Wars movie. So even though Lucasfilm was much more famous in terms of its usage of Star Wars, but a senior user, a prior user, at least was denied. I mean, Lucasfilm was denied summary judgment in that case, basically to say that there is a triable issue to be taken to trial before a court can conclude whether the Lucasfilm was correct in its estimation of trademark infringement and passing off or not. And finally, of course, the matter got settled. But that also is an interesting proposition from a point of view to look at a well-known trademark versus a mark which is not as well known, but nevertheless prior in time. Sorry, Nandini, please continue. I'm stopping to share my screen. Just, I think one question that someone had quickly before Nandini, you resume, I will, someone asked the question as to what are the factors to delineate whether a trademark is famous or not. I just pulled up 11(6) of the Trademarks Act. Sorry, it's not this one. Sorry, just give me a second. No, what I was saying was there are 5 large feedback is very good. But यहाँ कुछ छोटी कमी है. Let's try this. I think that is sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, so this is 11(6). Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
So the registrar shall, while determining whether a trademark is well-known trademark, take into account any fact which he considers relevant for the determining a trademark is well-known, including, so it's an inclusive definition, and it sets out these 5 parameters: the knowledge or recognition of that trademark in the relevant section of the public, including knowledge in India obtained as a result of promotion of the trademark. So basically, this gives you an idea that you can also have a well-known status of a foreign trademark. The duration, extent, and geographical area of any use of that trademark, duration, extent, geographical area of any promotion of the trademark, including advertising or publicity, presentation, etc. Duration and geographical area of any registration or any application for registration. And 5 is the record of successful enforcement of rights in that trademark, in particular the extent to which the trademark has been recognized as well-known trademark by any court or registrar under that record. Please move on, Nandini.
Okay. Riddhi, can you please share your screen?
Doesn't specifically say that the promotion has to be done by the person, the applicant. It could be anything. The promotion could be by anybody, by word of mouth.
Sneha, as I just said, that essentially, even if a licensee is promoting or using that trademark,
right.
then that inures to the benefit of the license or the owner.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So before we move to how a trademark is registered in India, it is very Riddhi, the next slide is fine. Yeah, this is okay. Now, it's important to understand that certain types of trademark get preference or are better protected when it comes to other categories of trademarks. So if we look at the hierarchy, it is invented or arbitrary marks will get preference over a suggestive mark, which will get preference over a descriptive mark, which will obviously be over a generic mark. So now when we're talking about an invented or an arbitrary marks, your invented trademark could be something on the lines of Twitter, where the services or the product is not associated with the, like, which is not directly relatable with the trademark, unless that association is created by the owner. So if we just think of Twitter before the whole Twitter service came into play of social media, we would not think of a social media being associated with a Twitter. So therefore, it is an invented trademark. Arbitrary could be where a particular word which is in existence of common usage is used for a product category or service which is not related to that particular category at all in any manner. So if you have to look at an Apple is a very good example of an arbitrary mark, where Apple as a mark or a logo is used for telephonic goods and there is no connection. Now tomorrow, if that same Apple word had to be used as a mark for a vegetable or a fruit vendor, it would then become a descriptive or a suggestive mark, not even a descriptive, a suggestive mark, where you could say that, okay, you can find apples in with this fruit vendor. So therefore, the class and the category which I was speaking of previously needs to be tied in with what the word or which trademark are we looking at what particular category. Coming next to a suggestive mark, like I said, Apple for a fruit vendor would be sort of suggestive. Netflix would be suggestive because it is bringing into concepts of internet, movies being available on internet. Obviously, there can be an argument that it is an invented word and not a suggestive word, but just to sort of I believe that it would be a suggestive mark. Even for that matter, a Snapchat is suggestive that you can chat on this particular social media application and send photographs. That's the main intent of that product. Coming to a descriptive mark, it could be something as simple as maps for Google Maps. For providing navigation services would be a descriptive mark. Now that it has acquired a secondary meaning, a trademark registry may still consider giving it a trademark registration, but that is again a debatable concept, a debatable proposition. Now, a generic mark would be something which was a trademark at one point of time for a particular goods or services, but now has been used and associated with that product so much, and there is that the product and the mark have become synonyms of each other, and the trademark owner has not taken up the onus of creating that disassociation or stopping relevant sections of people to associate the trademark with the service only. So to give you an example, thermos would be a very good example of that. Thermos was initially a trademark which is for a vacuum container to keep a substance hot, but now it has become so synonym that people can, when people say thermos, it could be a vacuum container of a brand such as Cello or any other brand, including Tupperware or whoever is creating that kind of a product. An interesting case would also be the Xerox case, which has, I mean, initially there was a lot of conversation around how it has become a generic mark, but when it was put to test in courts, I think in 2013 or 14 or maybe 18, I'm sorry, I don't remember the year, because the trademark owners produced so much of content around how much they are spending on trademarking, promotions, the kind of defenses that they are doing, that the Xeroxing machine and Xerox for photocopying is not granted a generic trademark for photocopying yet. So Xerox is still something which is protected under the law, But obviously, when we use it in common parlance so much, if it is not protected by the owner, it has a very what do you call it? It has a tendency of moving from a protectable trademark to a generic mark, which may not be able, which may not seek protection at a later stage.
Just coming in there, Nandini,
yeah.
There are two types of marks that
yeah.
are generic. One, of course, which are inherently generic.
Yeah.
Apple for Apple is generic.
Yeah.
So that's the basic criterion for a generic mark. But what you're talking about is the second category, where an otherwise invented or arbitrary or other mark could become generic on account of the failure of the trademark owner to either take enforcement actions in this regard, or to even to let people start using it in a generic manner so as to identify the trademark with the product itself, as you rightly said. In the case of thermos, the other examples, and this is what's called the mark falling into genericide. And the other examples are Singer, Goodyear. These are the examples of the earlier part of the 20th century, where when the first sewing machine was made, it was made by Singer, and then everyone started using Singer, and it fell into genericide, but then it was taken out of that subsequently. Goodyear in relation to tires. The best example that typically we give in relation to genericide is at the time of creation of the trademark itself. So Xerox, Goodyear, Singer, all of these were not intended to be or they were trademarks, they were used as trademarks, they just that because they were the leaders in those industries and perhaps also held a patent, and people did not have an alternative product, and that's why they created. So when we advise clients, specifically when they're creating a new product and they have to come up with a name, then we say, please think of two trademarks, or think of two, either a completely descriptive aspect and a trademark. So in the case of escalator, when the person invented it, if they would have said moving stairs and then branded it an escalator, then they would have been able to stop escalator from becoming generic. So that's typically the kind of advice that we give, specifically when you're the only player in that new market that you yourself are creating. Think of either a descriptive element to describe the product, which becomes the name of the product, so as to speak, and then another one, which is your trademark. Or if that is not possible and there is no dictionary word available to describe your product, think of two trademarks, one which will become generic and the other one will be your brand.
Yeah. Another, I was just reading up on how Netflix has also started falling into a generic word for OTT streaming platform, and how they would want to start. They are very protective about their trademark, and I think that's where all the trademark related user policies come into play. So bringing in the aspect that Anushri and Pridhi were discussing yesterday with respect to trademark policies which are in place by all these all these platforms which are used left, right, and center by people at large. Google has its own trademark policy only because they need to ensure and show at a later stage, or that they have a trademark policy in place so that it doesn't fall into the generic category. So when it comes to Abhishek rightly pointed, from a strategy perspective, along with having two different trademarks, descriptive and the invented mark, it would also be a good idea to have a strong trademark usage policy in place, where you set out what is okay and what is not okay, as in when your company becomes bigger. So
Nandini, I have a question. So you're talking about Google right now, right? So you know how colloquially we say Google it, right? Even though we mean a web search. So even though it's used, so because we're saying generic marks is something that can be used synonymously, you're saying purely because they have a trademark policy, it falls outside the ambit of generic. Is that one of the things that
it is a defense that can be used if at all it's been, and that's why they tell you how and where and how not to use it. And that's why in our SNP also we advise clients not to use a Google as a mark within the film, so that tomorrow there is no claim. So while how it is used is also a bone of contention, but because it is a registered trademark for the service which is being shown, a general, just because it's been said colloquially, it does not make it generic till the time the mark is being protected by the owner. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Riddhi, anybody has any questions up till now? Okay, I believe not. Moving to a life cycle of trademarks in India, obviously the life cycle starts at inception, which is not part of this particular chart flow. It starts at a section where somebody decides to launch a product and starts to think of various names which will be associated with that particular service or product that needs to be applied for. Once that is done, once the mark is sort of shortlisted, while shortlisting all the marks, we need to ensure, we need to sort of look into what is the mark that we have created. So the whole hierarchy as to how a mark should be created should be thought of, and also which classes and which services, how much promotions, what is being created. That is at the inception stage. All these factors are relevant while we are proposing the usage date of a particular trademark. Now coming to the slide, once the trademark is shortlisted, there is a search portal, which is a search which needs to be done at the trademark registry for ensuring that there is no deceptively similar mark to what is being proposed. Usually it is a very thorough search which needs to be done, only because there are judgments to the effect that just by changing one word or one syllable of a particular mark will not make it distinctive from the mark which is already existing. So it's very important to do a very thorough search when it comes to shortlisting a trademark. Once the search is done, we go into filing of a trademark, which is where information such as the proprietor who is filing the trademark becomes very important. Like we were discussing right now, for a Roger Federer, it would be important to sort of finalize who will own a particular trademark. It could be in a person, it could be in a company, it could be in an LLP, it could be in a special purpose vehicle, depending on what is the strategy behind a particular mark. Now, there are a lot of digressing a little bit here, but there are a lot of endorsement deals where a celebrity and a company together form another entity to sell a particular product. HRX would be a very good example of Hrithik Roshan and the company that he was with, forming a separate company to come up with athletic wear. And so depending on the category, how or who owns the trademark also makes a lot of, is also essential to establish at the beginning of the trademark cycle itself. So when we are filing, we need the name, the proprietor, the usage details of the trademark, which is since when has it been used, because like Abhishek also said in the beginning, and giving the example of Star Wars, a prior user gets preference over a mark which is yet to be used or which is brought into use later. However, there is another aspect to that entire prior use angle, which is where that it needs to be a continuous use and a voluminous use. Just because it was used once upon a time before a particular mark was used, that defense now does not stand. So while filing, we need the applicant, the user details, the class in which we are filing, and then obviously the description of the good and the logo, which logo or the trademark or what you are filing for. Once
Nandini,
that is,
sorry, just coming in, I just wanted to clarify a bit. It's prior use and continuous use.
Yeah.
It should not be sporadic.
Yeah.
It need not be voluminous, but it need not, it has to be,
okay.
It can't be sporadic.
Yeah.
It should be continued use.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant, but yeah, you're right. Sporadic is a better word to use. So once it is filed, then it goes to the registrar for his examination. Now, while the examination of the mark is being done, certain elements are looked into by the registrar. One is, and this is section 9 and section 11 of the Trademark Acts, which come into play, where while examining, the registrar may accept the mark or he may object the mark. The objection can be with respect to the mark being either non-distinctive of the trademark which is applied for, or it being too generic, or it being descriptive. These are the absolute grounds for refusal. When we are talking about Section 11 objections, then there are certain marks which may be similar to the mark which has been applied for. Now, at that stage, an examination report is generated by the examiner, who and which is being replied by us. If we can prove or if we can respond adequately as to show how the mark is distinctive and associated with the product or the service, then it may go on to being accepted, or it can go on to a hearing. Now, in the hearing, again, we need to produce evidence of, again, usage, and with usage, it comes as to how you're promoting the mark, how you're using it, or which is the category of, which market category are you targeting. All of those aspects then come into the show cause hearing stage. At both these stages, again, there are two options. One, if the registrar is satisfied, he goes on to accepting the mark. Otherwise, it gets refused. Abhishek, do you have any point to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one aspect that when you were mentioning the aspect that when you are filing the application, you must provide a date of first use.
Yeah.
There is also the option of applying for a trademark as a proposed to be used trademark. But the downside of that is that, so the upside is that you are essentially blocking a trademark from anyone else registering it in that particular class. Even before you can start using it, you have a thought, you like the trademark and you want to start using it, but you want to block someone else's usage of that trademark. That's why you want to apply. The downside is, unless it is an inherently distinctive mark, you're likely to face the issues of Section 9 and Section 11. So you typically what we advise our clients to do is that even if there is a 1 or 2 days of usage, you should apply for that trademark on that particular day that you start using it, etc. That's one option. The second option is where it is a larger organization. Typically, the process of adopting a trademark is not just that someone comes up with it and it's decided that this should be the trademark. They follow a process of engagement with a publicist or a company that actually advises them, creates a storyboard, comes up with options, give them those options. It goes back and forth, maybe it gets modified, etc. They do perhaps some amount of teaser campaigns in relation to limited audiences, etc. So in those instances, we say that even if you have taken steps towards your final use in a commercial sense, those steps could also be covered, because that's the intent to continue to use that particular trademark. And that's one of the judgments, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's a 1965 judgment of the Supreme Court, which says steps that you take to finally use the trademark could also be construed as use. Of course, they should not be sporadic. They should not be something which, you took a step in year 1 and you finally started using it year 3. There's a huge gap there, and that will be difficult to explain. But that's why an additional piece of advice that we give to the client, that perhaps if you have the material that where you shared it with a third party, because use in that sense could be construed as a communication of that trademark to a third party, either back and forth. So in that sense, then we start using that particular day as a date of first use, because intellectual property rights at the end of the day is all about priority, who got there first. That's the reason why we suggest that.
Yeah. Moving on, so from a mark being accepted, it gets into, it goes into being published into a journal of the trademark registry. Once it is published, there is a period of 4 months wherein even though the registry may not foresee an issue with the mark, people at large can file an opposition with respect to the mark which has been accepted. So there would be people who are, it could be people who are using similar marks trying to oppose that particular mark. So if it does not get opposed, it moves on to registration. And once it is registered, a mark is protected for a period of 10 years from the date of application and not from the date of registration. So that is the registration bit. If it gets opposed, there is a opposition proceedings which take place, wherein again, like the examination report, we have to prove a lot of usage related, you have to prove a lot of usage and show how the mark is distinctive from the person who's opposed it. Now, if the opposition is in favor of the applicant, then the mark proceeds to registration. If it is not, then it is refused. Once a mark is refused or abandoned, there is still a chance to appeal for this mark, and that can be done at the appellate board, or after the opposition, or we can file a review petition for the order of the opposition. Obviously, if both of these are unsuccessful, the mark is refused, and it's just refused. After a registration, a period of 10 years, there is an option of renewing the mark. So a trademark protection is periodic and therefore needs to be continuously protected. And if there is use, you continue to file the renewal fee and get protection for another 10 years from the date of expiration. Riddhi, if you could move to the next
just
slide.
One before we move on, just come back to the slide. The two aspects that I wanted to sort of point out. One is that, sorry, Nandini, are you dealing with rectifications in the next slide?
No.
So two things. One, of course, is that when you are filing, when any third party is filing a notice of opposition, at that time, the third party does not have to establish its own credentials as to what is the locus standi on the basis of which it is filing this opposition. The language used in the provision is any person. So in that sense, for example, I feel that a trademark is determinative of certain types of goods or services that are being vended by a particular community of business people. I may not be part of that association, but I can nevertheless oppose it, right? So locus standi is not a necessity in opposition proceedings, but after a trademark has been registered, because there is a presumption of prima facie validity of that trademark, therefore, when you go for rectification or cancellation of that trademark for various reasons, the grounds are limited, and you necessarily have to show that you're a person aggrieved by that registration continuing to be on the trademarks register in its present form. You must demonstrate how you are a person aggrieved and therefore demonstrate your locus standi. That's one. Second thing is that, the relative ground of refusal under 11 is available in the event that there is a similar trademark on the register by the registrar, and also in an opposition proceedings that someone brings about, saying that the registrar has failed to notice this trademark that was also on the register. The second one, of course, is, as Nandini pointed out, Section 9, absolute grounds of refusal. The interesting part is that Section 12 is some sort of an exception to Section 11, in as much as even if my trademark is deceptively similar or identical in that sense, if I can show an honest and concurrent use of my trademark, which is, so therefore the adoption of my trademark must be honest. I should not know of the other trademark which is already in use or on the register. And my trademark must have been concurrently used with that of the registered proprietor. In that event, I could still be allowed registration of my trademark if I meet the conditions of Section 12. It's fact specific. It's completely left to in that sense, the evidence produced in the discretion of the registrar. But that's one option that is available to register a trademark, even if you are a second comer, even if you're a subsequent user.
Yeah.
But as long as you satisfy the conditions of honest and concurrent use. Please proceed.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Tejas Ajay jumping in. I just had a small question regarding registration of film titles.
Yeah.
So typically in our business, there is usually a studio and a producer.
Yes.
So most of the time, because IP is owned by a studio, the studio files for registration of trademarks.
Correct.
Yes, 1 second. Sorry, I'm butting in here. And part of this presentation at a later point will deal with that.
Okay.
You just hold off your question till then.
Sure, no problem.
Maybe it will get answered while Nandini is presenting.
Absolutely. All right.
Okay. Okay, so within the life cycle, we had to discuss these pointers. We've discussed search, we've discussed about examination. Now coming to the limitations bit, there are certain trademarks which cannot be registered. It is pretty much on the lines of whatever is illegal, that principle that we were discussing for our standards and practices, that if it is something which is already a national, which is registered under your National Emblems Act, or if it is a name of a chemical, or if it is something, or if it is a name which is already registered with the company's registrar, then these names are not granted, they're not granted registration at all. So there is no, there would be no defense to it as well. Coming to concurrent use, like Abhishek said, there has to be honest use. While determining the concurrent use, the geographical locations are also something which has been looked at. If, for example, there is a shop which has prior usage, but only is limited to a particular section of a city or a state or a country, then there could be another person using a mark which is similar or same for similar services, provided that his usage is also not done with a malified intention of using the other person's goodwill. So while determining if a mark is of concurrent use, or if two parties can be given registration over same marks, it is all these factors are looked into. Another important factor which has been dealt with in the Trademarks Act is the fact that the registration for a mark is given for the a trademark protection is given only for the mark which has been registered by the applicant. So even if we have a mark which has a smaller subset of it, but not registered separately, proving or seeking protection under an infringement will become difficult. And then obviously there is the route of passing off which can be taken, but it is not a statutory protection which is given. So if everybody can see the TMT Law Practice logo which is on the side, there is a logo which is an amalgamation of the T and the M. There is TMT Law Practice and the whole mark, TMT Law Practice, where law meets innovation. If the entire mark is protected without separately filing for the T and M logo and a TMT law practice, it would be very difficult to stop a particular, stop another person from using a logo which is similar to the T and the M logo. Another aspect which has been covered in the Act is the fact that the registration again is provided for the mark as is. So today, if the registration is applied for this, I am not too sure of the color which is being used in M, but brown, green, and gray, then the protection will only be given for these particular sets of colors and not the entire color spectrum, which is where also the aspect of color being associated with a trademark sort of seeps into the into the Act. While color can be a trademark in itself, so how a Cadbury purple is associated with Cadbury. So if you see a chocolate packed in that particular purple, you can directly, instinctively associate it with Cadbury. That is, that would be a color registration for a trademark. Nowadays, even sounds can be trademarked. So, for example, the sound that is heard when a Netflix starts, or the sound which Dharma, what Dharma sets out before the opening of the film, those particular sounds can also seek protection under trademark if they are applied for. When a mark is applied for registration, then it is given the statutory protection, and therefore it's easier to file for an infringement rather than going the way of passing off where provisions of it being where the principle of somebody trying to use my goodwill against me is needs to be proved. So therefore, registration of a trademark gives a lot of protection to a particular brand, and how it is used during its exploitation can start giving protection to it outside the brand category that has been applied for. Does anybody have any questions till now, or any inputs that you guys would want to add to with respect to your experiences?
Nandini, I just want to ask, that Cadbury was denied that purple color registration, right?
Yeah.
So can you give an example of wherein somebody got a color registration, some famous?
I am not sure of it. I haven't, color registration is not a particular color being associated. It's the packaging and the way you are associating. It's not, I'm saying that the color is given protection along with the mark.
The entire thing, basically, the entire
design. The entire design is a separate ball game altogether. Yeah. So that is not within the ambit of trademarks, but the packaging of the product, how it is packaged, the font that you use,
and the color.
So and the color. Included. All the things together will, yeah, look and feel. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else?
Nandini, sorry, just coming in here.
Yeah.
We'll see past the clarification. One is when you were describing the, sorry, I'll first address color because that's the last thing I will discuss. So it's, you are right to the extent that yes, packaging overall is protected, but the definition of a mark under 1M of the Act, when it's listing out the various features of what a mark can be, what can constitute a mark.
Yeah.
Right? It refers to not color, combination of colors.
Yeah.
So you can never have a registration over a single color.
Single color. Yeah.
It will always be a color combination. Right? So in this case, it's gold. In the TMT law practice, it's gold and black.
Gold and black. Okay, gray, sorry.
Yeah, but that's so. And the seminal case also in India in relation to the protection of color combination is in relation to Colgate Palmolive case, where what they were also again protecting was the white and red combination. Yeah, so it's always a color combination first.
Okay.
Second thing is important to note is that, and that's what we advise clients also. Sometimes clients say that I want this particular color combination because that's what I'm going to use.
Yeah.
What we advise the client to do is apply for black and white.
Yeah.
Because when you apply for black and white, you get covered for all color combinations.
Correct.
Right? But if you are limiting yourself to a particular color combination, you may want to still do it. It's then going to be limited only to that color combination.
Correct.
Your registration. Your usage may be such that you may be able to control another color combination of the same mark by under a passing off theory. But you will not be covered then under the trademark
infringement. Correct.
Right? So that's one in relation to color combination. The second thing is the composite mark.
Yeah.
Yes, as you rightly said, it's protected as is. So this composite mark of TMT law practice with the logo TMT law practice where law meets innovation is the composite mark, which will be, if it's registered, as and when it's registered, it will get protection for the entire trademark.
Correct.
And that's section 17. Now, the individual elements of this, unless separately applied for protection, do not get a registered trademark protection.
That's correct.
You could nevertheless base your claim on an individual aspect of this on a passing off theory.
Yeah.
Secondly, some courts have also recognized this principle of what is the essential feature of the trademark. So if the essential feature of a registered trademark is such which is being used by someone else, then it would get covered even under trademark infringement analysis. Now, just to give an example, a crude example, where law meets innovation is not the essential feature of the trademark.
Correct.
So if someone uses that, unless where law meets innovation is separately registered and or used, and therefore I could claim this as a passing of action, this will not be considered that. But perhaps the logo of the TMT law practice one as a word mark, also because it's separately registered, plus separately the logo, these could be the essential features.
Correct.
So, and just a question of argument, just a question of whether you're able to gather enough of an evidence to demonstrate what you're trying to argue.
I just have a question, maybe a little redundant. So if we apply for, say, like our logo has 2 colors, 2 or 3 combination of colors used. Now, if somebody applies with a different set of color combination, so that will be opposed obviously, but will that fall under grounds of passing off or a trademark infringement directly?
If the registration is for this color combination, then I can only go for passing off. But if the registration has been applied for as a black and white, then I can go for infringement as well.
Okay.
Should we move on, or is there anything else that we would like to discuss?
No, let's move on.
Okay. Riddhi, if you could take us to the next slide. Okay, so now coming to protection of movie titles. Now, there are a lot of ways in which the industry works when it comes to registering a movie title. There are certain organizations which have been formed, which were formed with an intention of creating prior usage for a mark which was applied for and registered within that particular organization, and not going to the registration of the trademark route. So there has been a lot of controversy, dispute is a better word, dispute around the fact that when a particular mark is registered with a voluntary association versus somebody who registers a similar mark before or after it, or does not register a mark and goes ahead and releases a film, there is no statutory protection for such industry practices which are currently in place, other than maybe breach of contract, which would be only if the registration is within the same association. Currently, there are numerous associations which are in place, which could be on the lines of IMPA or Indian Film and Television Film Producers Council. or any other film writers association or screen writers association right now, which is in place. Now, one interesting question which came up with respect to title protection was in this case for Double Trouble. What had happened was that there is a Punjabi film called Double Trouble. There are two Punjabi films, Double Trouble and Double the Trouble. Now, Prism, which was Prism Motions, which was the producer of Double Trouble, filed for protection at IMPA in March 2013, and the registration was granted by IMPA in July 2014. Parallelly, Mukta Arts produced a movie called Double the Trouble in Punjabi and released it in 2014. Now, Prism Motion Pictures moved to Delhi High Court to seek an injunction stating that there has been an infringement of the title and there will be a lot of confusion which will be created, and therefore Double the Trouble should not be allowed to release their film. The courts in Double the Trouble and various other judgments have relied on the fact that the title of the film needs to acquire secondary meaning to seek protection, and therefore if a film which has not been produced or not been released and merely by the fact that it was registered with an association, protection cannot be sought. Accordingly, injunction was not granted, and Double the Trouble, which was the Mukta Art film, was went on and got released. Another similar case had happened when it came to Veere Di Wedding and Veere Ki Wedding, where in Veere Di Wedding, Anil Kapoor Films moved to court stating that Veere Ki Wedding, which was to be released, would create a lot of confusion between the public at large, and therefore Veere Ki Wedding should be injuncted and should not be produced. However, again, the same principle of the movie not being released and not having enough goodwill or acquiring a secondary meaning to it, they did not injunct on the release of Veere Ki Wedding. Now, I looked up the registry. Right now, Veere Di Wedding is a registered trademark, and Veere Ki Wedding is not a registered trademark. So tomorrow is not a mark which has been applied for also, in fact. So tomorrow, if there is another film which is related to this concept and title which is similar to Veere Di Wedding or even Veere Ki Wedding, then Anil Kapoor Films will have a better IP protection strategy versus a Veere Ki Wedding, even though the marks could be similar and now both have been released, both have certain audiences. So Veere Di Wedding will get better protection because it is now a registered trademark. So they will not have to get into the aspect of, then they can proving a secondary meaning attached to it. Are we? Yeah.
So, but then Veere Ki Wedding already released.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I've just given my example. Like I faced it personally. Like one day it was coming on TV, Veere Ki Wedding, and I actually thought that it was Veere Di Wedding because I couldn't see it. So, but then if it is a registered trademark, their trademark is already being like infringed, right?
No. So the whole idea is around concurrent use as well that we had spoken of. So back when Veere Di Wedding had released, it was not a mark which was applied for. The application of Veere Di Wedding has only happened in 2017, around the time that the judgment was being pronounced or the order was being given. So because now courts have already declared that there is no confusion as to between the public at large, there is no infringement which is happening. Now today, even if you have to talk about that you had a confusion in your head while watching Veere Ki Wedding, thinking that it was Veere Di Wedding, the intent of Veere, the producers of Veere Ki Wedding, which is Make My Day Entertainment, is not to ride on the goodwill of Veere the Wedding, right? So, so now there is no infringement per se happening, but tomorrow if there is, tomorrow if it wants to get into merchandising, and if because it is phonetically similar, if visually it is very, very dissimilar, so tomorrow if it goes into merchandising and they are using characters of the film, right? You will not get confused with a Jimmy Shergill. If a Jimmy Shergill is on the t-shirt and you want to buy that merchandise, you will not get confused of it being Veere Ki Wedding, Veere the Wedding, only because the star cast, the concept and the packaging is entirely different when it comes to Veere Ki Wedding.
Okay.
If I can just add over here, back then, also the court was a little hesitant to grant any injunctions with Veere Ki Wedding, purely on the principle. I think y'all can tie it better when using your trademark, the trademark tag, because Veere Ki Wedding, Veere the Wedding, very colloquially used means my best friend's wedding. It's something that people use commonplace. So they were very hesitant to injunct a film based if both the films are based on weddings. Unfortunately, I've not seen Veere Ki Wedding, but Veere the Wedding is based on one of the best friends' weddings. So it in that manner, I'm assuming, became something just colloquially
a generic
used.
and a generic title also.
And back then also Anil Kapoor films were, like Nandini keeps pointing out, had not expended any monies towards advertising and creating an association or link in the mind of the people that this film is specifically an Anil Kapoor film. Not enough to create any confusion whatsoever in anyone's mind regarding the two separate films at all. So I don't know how that ties in. And also the court specifically then to somehow, I'm assuming, to strike some balance, set a fixed number of days that had to be there between the release of both films in order to reduce the likelihood of confusion. And the marketing activity, there had to be, like, I think a gap of 45 days or something, so that there was no likelihood of confusion. I mean, I don't know how that ties in with your trademark, but or that this was purely one-off situation that happened.
Nandini, are you going to be discussing the Sholay matter?
Not in detail, because I think it's fairly known to everybody in the industry.
That Ramgarh ke Sholay wala.
Yeah. We can discuss it as a. I mean, I'm not going to be discussing it in detail, but if you want to bring it up,
because I can just what you just mentioned as one of the bases to
secondary meaning,
from a secondary meaning point of view, and also from the point of view of when you are looking specifically at film titles, given the fact that typically film titles will be combinations of generic dictionary words, or they would be descriptive in the meaning that they impart, and or they have a limited shelf life. Even industry practices that it is, when a title is registered with the industry association, it's valid only for 10 years. So unless of course you want to sort of do something with it. The only instance, I think, in that sense where there has been the imparting of secondary meaning is in the case of Sholay. And because it's kind of a cult film, and because of the fact that its producers have actually made an effort to not only aggressively protect that trademark, but also try and look at licensing options, etc. And of course, clearly that film has been playing in theaters also at record sort of number of theaters over a period of time, etc. All those, so that is a very and it's an exception to the rule in that sense. But the important part is that when the Delhi High Court was looking at the Ramgarh ke Sholay wala matter, it went into the reason why it gave that injunction was not only because the word Sholay was used in the subsequent film of Ram Gopal, but also because there were a lot of character names correct. Yeah, Gabbar Singh and others.
Yeah.
So I think it's that entire look and feel. It's the entire perspective of trying to really do it in a mala fide, trading on someone else's reputation aspect that came in for the court to decide what it did. But typically speaking, film titles are not a very robust type of a trademark or trademarkable, if I can use that word.
Correct.
Type of whatever, not that category in my mind.
Oh, okay. So again, even in the Sholay matter, because Gabbar was as a character, there were certain trademark registrations also done in for the characters of each specific characters, and the association which it had created. The court and the usage, like Abhishek rightly pointed out, the usage of Sholay along with Gabbar Singh and the setting of the film is something that that made the court to injunct the film, which led Ram Gopal Varma to change the title of the film along with not using Gabbar Singh as a character in the film. Now, that being said, it does not mean that somebody else cannot use Gabbar Singh as a character in a film. It is a generic name, but how it is tied in with the product which is being offered makes a lot of difference. Therefore, when we are talking about categories of merchandising, it also sort of ties in with merchandising, endorsement, the goodwill of a film. So all of these aspects of intellectual property sort of tie in together when we are trying to protect the film and its monetization in various forms. So that's being one. Second is when we are talking about a title of a film, while the script in the script of a film may be protected under copyright law, there are more than enough judgments. Desi Boys, the Krishna Lula, and the Nishabd case being primary cases and noteworthy cases in this aspect. There are more than enough cases to state that while the script may get copyright protection, the title of the work in itself is not protectable. Now there are, so these are the, this is also one aspect. Riddhi, if you could move to the next one.
Sorry, just hold on for a bit. I don't know whether when you were discussing the Hariputtar matter, one nuance to the conceptual aspect of that is that in relation to trademarks, generically and specifically with regard to perhaps film titles, there is this concept of fair use.
Yes.
And typically in trademark, it's referred to as nominative fair use, where you are using a trademark or a variation thereof to actually not confuse the public that, as in you, the second comer, are using the reputation of another's trademark to show some sort of a causal link between your product and that one's, so that you get the start. But you are actually pointing out to that trademark itself, and I showed traces of that in section 30 when we were discussing that. As long as, of course, it is not against the commercial, and industrial practices, and it does not cause the detrimental. It's not used in the manner that causes the reputational damage. And it's a very thin line, because in the case of fair use, you could cross that line to be able to, for the plaintiff to demonstrate that you are actually doing it in such a manner that it injures the goodwill and reputation. So it's a very thin line, but as a defense, it's typically is available in law. It's just a question of how it will actually play out on facts.
So just taking a Abhishek's point on how reputation is also a very important factor while it is being looked into. If you could move into the next slide. There was a very interesting case on runningshadi.com, where shadi.com filed a case against this particular film title, saying that because shadi.com is being used as the title of the film, where the whole idea around the film was that there was a service which could make couples elope to get married. There is a lot of harm to the reputation of shadi.com will happen, and therefore Delhi High Court agreed with that analysis and said that because shadi.com is part of the title, may create confusion, it may damage the trademark of shadi.com. Therefore, the injunction was granted to a point where it said that you cannot use shadi.com while releasing or in part of any promotional activity that you're doing, and also ask them to remove all existing promotional material which was in the market already. The film did finally release, but only as Running Shadi and not as runningshadi.com. Something similar also happened with the Rubik's Cube matter, where the title of the film was Rubik's Cube, and the Rubik's Cube brand of the toy, or I think I can call it a toy. They went ahead and filed an injunction saying that the usage of Rubik's Cube as part of the title of the film, even if the theme of the movie is not around the product or they have not shown any association with product, could go ahead and dilute their trademark. So even though class 41 is very separate from a class 28, because Rubik's Cube was is a mark which is known to public at large, there could be a dilution of the mark if the film is released with the title Rubik's Cube. Injunction was granted by the court and the title had to be changed. But like when we're talking, yeah. Abhishek, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, coming in relation to this aspect of the Rubik's Cube matter, of course, it's not always that the courts get it right.
Yeah.
I'm just comparing two contrary situations. Well, one was a similar in the runningshadi.com aspect. There was a case in 2000-2001 in relation to Naukri.com, and and that is, of course, as we all know, that's the job site, and that was at that point had just about come up. Maybe it was a couple of years old.
Yeah.
And someone else had also got a domain name registered with not Naukri but Naukri.
Right.
So therefore, a case was filed and an injunction was granted, despite the fact that it was shown it was argued by the defendant that Naukri is generic for a job site, or if not generic, at least descriptive and highly descriptive. So absent a very high level of secondary meaning, it should not be allowed, and I should be allowed to use it as a portal. But the Delhi High Court disagreed, and perhaps that's one of the instances where it said that even a generic trademark on account of usage can acquire distinctiveness, which in terms of purely a jurisprudential analysis is incorrect. A descriptive mark can, of course, acquire distinctiveness on the basis of secondary meaning. A generic mark can never do that. You can pull a generic mark out of generic size or genericness if it had earlier been a trademark and which had fallen into generic, but you can't do it in relation to an inherently generic trademark, is what the analysis is. In relation to the Rubik's Cube matter, now there is this debate, the theory of dilution as against likelihood of confusion. Likelihood of confusion originated in common law in UK.
Correct.
But dilution is an American concept
in
relation to a well-known trademark, etc.
Right.
Now, the question therefore is, when you are granting an injunction, is in trademark infringement regular analysis, it is the standard is likelihood of confusion, not actual confusion.
Correct.
But In case of dilution, because it talks about a famous trademark and it is in a different category of goods or services, is the analysis to be limited only to likelihood of dilution or actual dilution? Was the question, right? And the courts came to the conclusion that likelihood of dilution is not enough. You have to demonstrate a very high degree of proof, even at the interim stage, to get an injunction, and that should be tending to show actual dilution. So, and the courts in India have tended to look at that as an analysis. I think it was in the ITC case where it was looked at, but in this Rubik's Cube matter, it seems to me that because this is an interim injunction that was granted, it was not, and of course maybe they would have demonstrated by way of overwhelming evidence at the interim stage itself that dilution is established. But typically speaking, that's the, I just brought it in to show that these are the two competing thoughts or theories which could be put to different effects depending upon whether it's a regular trademark infringement analysis or a dilution analysis.
Correct. Okay, moving forward to what we were speaking about of Harry Potter and how your market and your target audience is also something which is looked at by the courts while deciding a matter on trademark infringement. Like I said, that while Harry Potter as a character is world famous, but because trademarks is a territorial matter, once the court held that because only a particular section of the audience would be able to associate Harry Potter with a Harry Potter, and how they said that it would not create any confusion, and therefore injunction was not granted with respect to Harry Potter being used as the title of the film. Obviously, the analysis is something which can be debated and discussed, in my view, but that's the current status of the Harry Potter case. Now, another aspect which really needs to be kept in mind while protecting the IP in a project is that timely action is extremely important when it comes to a film, at least, or a product or a business. This was demonstrated in the Kabhi Alvida Na Kehna case, where Bishwaroop Roy Chaudhary had also filed for a registration of the same title, Kabhi Alvida Na Kehna. In fact, produced 40% of the film around the time that Karan Johar went ahead and was about to release Kabhi Alvida Na Kehna as a film. Now, because this case was brought up just before or just around the corner that the release was to happen, the courts were of the view that the request for injunction is extremely delayed and would cause a lot of harm to the producer Karan Johar, if at all the court granted injunction, and therefore injunction was not granted, and Kabhi Alvida Na Kehna went on to be released with the same title. So that brings us to the end of this particular aspect. And now we can open the forum for questions.
Yeah, so Tejas here. So coming back to my question. So my question is basically from point of view of registration. So typically in a film there is a studio and there is a producer.
Right.
Studio most of the times owns the IP. But it so happens that the producer who is actually shooting the film, they have registered the title with these associations, IMPA and other associations.
Right.
So would that be a problem for a studio to register the mark with the trademark authorities? Also from the point of view that when we try to register a mark, we usually try to give some proof of first usage. In some cases, we might want to give the proof of the earlier registration, which is the IMPA registration or the registration with Producers Guild. But in such cases,
Right.
that registration is in the name of the producer and not in the name of the studio. So what typically can be done in such cases?
In such cases, you can ask the associations to carry out a name change if you want to use that particular use of date. And then the name can be registered by the studio at the trademark registry with the same date, because they are two separate entities altogether. Also, even if the assignment does not happen, and you go ahead with the trademark registry, the producer in itself will not be using the mark after it has been produced and assigned to a studio. So while the services agreement is being negotiated and discussed, I think it would be very imperative to carry out all these procedural changes as well, wherein the name transfer happens so that you can use the title registration for your trademark registration as well.
Okay. And also in a case where the IP is jointly owned, as in when there are two producers, and one of the producers who has applied for the registration with the association, and the other then wants to apply for a trademark, can they do that?
Honestly, it will just lead to dispute, and with respect to how, okay, so for a co-production, it depends on what is the intent of the title registration. Now, if there are two people who are going to be jointly using it, at the end of the day, it depends on where the IP of the exploitation rights sit. That is my analysis, and anybody can obviously chip in whenever they want to. But as the exploitation rights would vest with the studio, even if studio goes ahead and files for a registration, then it would go into the opposition stage where the producer may choose to oppose any acceptance or registration which is being granted, and seek a rectification where the co-producer may also want to be a joint applicant for that particular trademark.
Also, just coming in that typically, unlike copyright, the Trademarks Act frowns upon a joint ownership of a trademark in two unconnected entities, because it is precisely the aspect of likelihood of confusion and public perception that that militates against the property being held in two different sources. The question of source recognition becomes a confused one. That's why, to the extent possible, the trademark registry would not allow a joint ownership of a trademark registration. And of course, if there is a huge amount of clarity in the manner in which the enforcement of that is to take place, or the parties are fairly clear in taking that forward, maybe they will allow. And what used to happen earlier, when the digital domain and the ease of movement of goods in between different geographies was not so easy. I mean, it was very tough to actually be physically present or have the channel of distributing particular products through various geographies or on the internet, etc. At that time, a geographical division or a country versus export division, all those were still prevalent, and those could be exercised as options of joint ownership. However, today that becomes more and more difficult to enforce, and you have many instances of overlapping rights. Even though people may have agreed to differentiate their geographical extent of exploitation, there are many instances where either a distributor will move into another person's jurisdiction, or as the case may be, you're supplying over the internet through e-commerce platforms, and that becomes a huge issue. That's why more and more trademark registry is now discouraging. I mean, earlier, it's specifically provided for under the Act, But even otherwise, the trademark registry discourages joint ownership of a trademark registration, primarily to get rid of this particular issue.
Tejas, does that answer your question?
Yes, fairly, yes.
Yeah. So also what you could do in your co-production agreements, just to avoid any disputes at a later stage, maybe have a provision to the effect that around the trademarking and who is going to own and file for that would be a clean way of capturing the understanding.
Got it. Got it. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else has any other questions? If you guys,
I have another question.
Coming back to, sorry, the provision that I was talking about, section 40 of the Act, which deals with that chapter deals with assignment and transmission of trademarks. I'm just reading it out. Notwithstanding anything in sections 38 and 39, a trademark shall not be assignable or transmissible in a case in which, as a result of the assignment or transmission, there would in the circumstances subsist, whether under this act or any other law, exclusive rights in more than one of the persons concerned to the use in relation to the same goods or services, same description of goods or services, or description of goods or services which are associated with each other, of trademarks nearly resembling each other, or of identical trademarks, if having regard to similarity of the goods and services and to the similarity of the trademarks, the use of the trademarks and exercise of those rights would be likely to deceive or cause confusion, right? So therefore, there is an inherent, jaundice, if I can call it that, perspective that the Trademarks Registry and Trademarks Act has in creation of exclusive rights in relation to similar or identical trademarks, in the event that such use of the trademarks are likely to cause deception or confusion. Sorry, someone was talking when I butted in.
Yeah, it's Tejas here again. So I had another question on the brands.
Yes.
So basically, usage of brands in background of a film. So in scenes.
Yeah.
So would that typically amount to infringement when there is no derogatory usage as such, and it's just a passing usage? When, like, for example, if there's a scene which is shot in a mall and a lot of brands in the background, would that amount to an infringement if the permissions have not been taken? Because it so happens that there are a lot of brands which are appearing in the background, and it becomes really difficult to take permissions from each and every brand or ownership or an NOC from all these brands.
Right. So the answer to that would be that from a risk aversion perspective, it's always better to blur out these brands and not show any brand which can tomorrow get up and go ahead and file a case. We had discussed this in yesterday's session as well, where we talked about the usage of a brand in a passing of in a background or in an ancillary manner, how it is used and what kind of an impact it would create on the brand. While it may be a passing use for you, how the brand sees it may be different, and there could be again a dispute which may arise. So as a production house or as somebody who's producing movies or owns IP, it is always better to steer clear of any third party products which you don't have the rights for.
Okay. Alright, I think my questions are done. So,
okay.
Thank you.
So if anybody has any other questions or wants to discuss any aspect that comes to their mind. Okay. I think that brings us to an end of our session. If you have any queries, you can write to Abhishek, Sapna, Bhagmishka, or I, if it's trademark related, and we'll be happy to address the same for you.
Thanks, everyone. And as Nandini said, happy to address any queries offline if anyone still has those, and you can email it to us, and then we'll try to respond. We will be continuing with the trademark discussion tomorrow in relation to sporting events and personalities, personality rights, and franchising, which will be taken up by Ahana. So look forward to hosting all of you again at 11:30 tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you, Nandini.
Thank you, Nandini.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.